Hey, I'm Nikki, and this is the importance of having a diverse tour guide team. Who gets to be a local tour guide? Right? We use that term a lot, local tour guide, authentic local tour guide. This is actually a regular argument I had at a previous job with local teams who define local specifically as someone who was born in the city or at least in the country where they were guiding. And true, there is something very special about having a guide who has a history in the very neighborhood that you're touring. I used to give a Lower East Side tour that would pass through Little Italy, and I would point out to guests the exact tenement where my grandmother grew up. And that's very impactful. But I would argue, on the other hand, there is a lot of value in an expat guide who can explain to you why New Yorkers might come off as rude, which is something that might be hard for a native to put into words because I obviously don't think we're rude, so I can't explain it to someone. There's a lot of value in that expat guide and perspective. So if all of your guides have a similar background and experience, both in guiding and in life, your tours are all going to be comprised of the same stories and histories, right? They're all alike. They're all reading the same resources. However, when you have a diverse group of guides, there are so many more perspectives, stories, and skills to share, which can boost your entire team and enrich your tours. In this article, I'll explain how you can elevate your entire team by making sure it reflects the diversity of your city or country. So I'll make it easy. I'll give you a checklist, right, of a diverse guide team. And keep in mind, each city, each country is diverse in its own way, right? So the idea is to have your tour guide team accurately reflect the diversity that is unique to where your tours are from, right? So this will look different in every city, but you just want to you just want to reap the full benefits of the skill sharing and story sharing that can happen between guides. So here's some groups you want to make sure are reflected in your team. Okay, the big one. Natives and non-natives, or expats, right? Whatever that means to you. In Japan, there was a team that was very hesitant to hire expat tour guides, thinking guests would be disappointed when they discovered their English-speaking local guide was a white guy from California, right? Which is a valid fear. But as mentioned before, there is a lot of insight in an expat who can provide to travelers who are foreigners themselves what is going on in a culture, right? And if it's pitched right to the guests at the beginning of the tour, it can be seen as a really, really big value. Eventually, this team in Japan began hiring expats and saw a huge change in their original team, who were all Japanese natives. The original team, their English proficiency improved because they were now having regular meetings that were run in English because of their new colleagues. And they were also better able to understand foreign guests better than their colleagues. Sometimes you might not realize what is different to a guest because it's your reality, right? You might need that outside perspective sometimes. Age diversity. In most countries I've visited, there tends to be a very old guard and new guard of guides, which are slightly contentious sometimes. Veteran guides tend to have more experience with the traditional and quickly becoming outdated way of guiding, which is more aligned to a lecture, right? Value being perceived by how many facts your guides knew. However, I would argue both veterans and new guides of an older age have a wealth of life experience and history they can draw upon. A younger guide giving a tour of 9/11 might be able to recall their impressions of what was going on as a child at that time, but someone who was already an adult, on that fateful day, working in an office when they saw the planes hit. I mean, that's a very impactful story that they can share with their fellow guides, right? Having much more memory of the day. These guides will also be able to give better insight into tour details for older guests, which is still a huge chunk of customers for a lot of tour operators. For example, an older guide might be able to point out, hey, on this new tour, that's a lot of walking with no bathroom stops, right? Or, hey, there's a lot of steps up to that bridge. Is there an elevator option? Which might not have been thought of by the younger guides. Racial diversity. This is the more obvious one, probably, and I will argue that even in the most homogenous cities, you will find racial diversity, right? Immigrants have spread across the world for generations, and requiring your guides to read about the history of, let's say, Chinatown in San Francisco is one thing, but having a Chinese American guide who can tell stories of their ancestors who worked on the railroads, right, generations ago, is going to raise the bar of your tour content. Think about indigenous people, gypsies, modern day immigrants, religious groups. Um, all of these are groups that tend to be represented in every city around the world. The ugly fact is that often these minorities don't have the same privileges as a majority. And while tour guides certainly do not make riches, there is a certain privilege in being able to take the leap to freelance, right? So you are looking at a smaller pool of people. You can go one step further and partner with local nonprofits offering job trainings to these minority groups. And I won't get into, socioeconomic diversity, which could be an entirely differently category. But, the shining example for me is Invisible Cities, an amazing social enterprise that trains people affected by homelessness to become walking guides. So I highly recommend looking them up. The final one I'll offer is experience diversity. More experienced guides obviously bring a lot to the table. There are some things that you really can't teach. You have to learn, like timing and reading a group. But guiding is hard. And even the best guides fall into a routine, right? Or fall into a way of doing things. Newer guides, who can learn so much from experienced guides, can also bring new energy and a willingness to evolve and grow, which can be infectious to your team and which is vital in creating top-notch tours.